Well, thanks very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here at a very timely and important conference. And I spend a lot of time on the road visiting universities. I probably visit about 50 or so a year, and have been to Plymouth before. I've visited the College of Art. I've even visited the school the College of Art sponsors, but I've never actually visited Plymouth University before, so it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you. For those of you who don't know, my name's Nick Hillman. I'm director of HEPI, and HEPI is, there's our logo, it is the country's only specialist independent think tank on higher education. So as our name suggests, that is all we do. There's a few facts about us. I regard us as having three roles, really. The first is to join up the dots as much as we can between policymakers in Westminster and Whitehall, perhaps even in the devolved assembly sometimes, and those of you working in institutions. My background, I've studied at 3 different universities and I've worked on higher education policy for over a decade, but I've never actually been an employee of a university, but my background is the opposite. My background is working in Whitehall, and I spent nearly 10 years, including 3.5 in government, working for David Willits, and I was his special advisor when he was the universities minister. So I have seen some of this from the other side. I sometimes think our role, trying to get the two sides to understand each other, is a bit like Douglas Adams's Babel fish. I don't know if you remember, you put it behind your ear and you can understand any language in the world. The only problem was by effectively removing all barriers to communication between different cultures and races, it's caused more and bloodier wars than anything else in the history of creation. They're how I sometimes envisage ourselves. And then another thing we do is we hold lots of events. We do about a dozen events every year. We've done in the last fortnight a roundtable session on UKRI and the future of research funding in the UK. We've done a roundtable discussion also in the last fortnight on widening participation, where we had Les Ebden, we had Alan Rusbridger, Master of Oxford College, we had Tim Blackman, Vice Chancellor of Middlesex, we had Mary Colonel-Cook and others all discussing WP issues. We're now looking forward to our annual lecture, which is on the 8th of December. You're all very welcome, so long as you're registered in advance. And it's delivered by a lady who's not nearly as well known in the UK as she should be. She's called Martha Cantor, and she was Obama's first HE minister for the whole of his, they don't use the phrase HE minister, but that's what the role she did for the whole of her first period in government. The whole of his first presidency, those 4 years. And there's a lovely drinks reception afterwards if that's not enough to entice you there. And then the other thing we do is we produce a stream of publications. We did 15 last year. We're very small, but we did do 15 publications last year. And I really see our role as injecting quality evidence, sometimes polemical, but well-rooted polemical arguments into the policy debate to make sure the issues are being considered. In the last few months, we did a report on student mental health. This is actually our only report ever in nearly 15 years of existence, actually written for us by a serving undergraduate student, and it really benefited from that because she brought to it a whole range of her own personal experiences and her friends' personal experiences. And there's 25 policy recommendations in that report. The one that got all the media coverage was universities should spend 3 times as much as they do on counselling, which isn't actually quite what we said. We said the universities that do the least should look to something like triple their spending, and all that would do would actually bring it up to the level of those who do the most. So all our publications are free in hard copy and soft copy, all freely available online. If you want to be on our database, let us know. The reason they're free is we're funded by 110 universities across the country, including Plymouth, and we're very grateful for that support. Another recent report we did was the underachievement of young men in education, and as you will know, given the theme of this conference, young men are much less likely now to go to university than young women. They're more likely to drop out of their degree before the end, and they're less likely to get a first or a 2-1. And we looked at some of the issues surrounding that. And again, that had 7 clear policy recommendations that covered the period before entry to university, the period while at university. We even refer to the power of learning analytics, which I see some of your posters are on for tackling this issue, and also, before at entry and then while you're in university as well. That was some of the press coverage. That was actually one of the least accurate press articles about it, which was written actually by Michael Gove's wife in a 3-page piece in the Mail. But if you're a small think tank, you have to, beggars can't be choosers, and you please buy any press coverage you can get. But there was more accurate press coverage than that as well. And we also did a report on what students think about free speech. I was concerned that it was pretty clear what vice-chancellors through Universities UK think about some of the tricky free speech issues on campus, whether it's trigger warnings or safe spaces or selling tabloid newspapers and student union in shops or roads must fall campaigns. And it was also pretty clear where the NUS leadership, the National Union of Students leadership, stood on those issues. But I was concerned it wasn't that clear where the mass of students stood on these issues. And we did a survey. We actually found students remarkably illiberal, but I think that's partly due to not thinking about these issues in as deep a way as perhaps universities and organisations like mine might be encouraging them to do so. But that was another very interesting report, and I think no one else has done anything quite like that. We've got reports in gestation at the moment. We've got one on league tables that should be out before Christmas, on international league tables, so we truly understand the inputs into those league tables and why too much is read into them. We've got a piece coming out on BTECs, and BTEC, the transformation in the entry qualification. In other words, far more students are arriving at universities, you well know, with BTECs and a mix of BTECs and A-levels, and what the consequences of that are, and also one on technology-enabled learning, written for us by JISC. But only one of those will be out before Christmas, but they will all be out. Now, I've been asked to talk about teaching excellence and the Higher Education Research Bill, and I will talk about both of those things, I promise. But I think it would be odd not to begin, given the times we're living in, without referring to the sort of international political turmoil that's been going on. And in the last few months, among the challenges we've had just in higher education, is an EU referendum, which of course has consequences for the sector, a new Prime Minister, a new Secretary of State for Education. We've had higher education, or at least the teaching and learning function of universities, put into the new government department, the Department for Education. We've had the research functions of universities stay in the department they were in before, but that department's been rejigged, so it's now business, energy and industrial strategy. So pretty much everything has changed, and there's one or two other things on the slide which I haven't even mentioned. This slide amused me over the summer when we were living in the UK through that rapid pace of change with all the changes. If you can't read at the back, it says, to students, I'm studying politics. The course covers the period from 8 a.m. on Thursday to lunchtime on Friday. And that was the period, the immediate aftermath of the referendum result. Donald Trump, of course, calls his victory Brexit plus plus plus. I used to teach history in schools, not in universities, and it's often said, one of the things you teach when you're a history teacher is that new centuries never start when there's 0-0 at the end of the year. They always start a few years into the century with, of course, the 19th century probably starting when the Napoleonic Wars finished, the 20th century probably starting with the outbreak of the First World War, and perhaps, who knows, we will date the start of this century to the momentous events of this year. But of course, the truth is no one really knows what Brexit means for HE. No one really knows what the Trump victory yet means. We can't say even what Brexit will mean for our research base, and yet that is one of the areas where we were a clear net beneficiary of EU funding. And for me, it's perhaps best summed up by a recent House of Commons library note produced to inform MPs and peers about the current situation. It says, what do we not know about Brexit? An awful lot. We don't even know when the negotiations can start, let alone what they will be about or when they will end. And of course, some of that picture is becoming a little bit clearer, but it's still basically opaque. And I just want to make two observations before I move on to the bill and the TEF. And the first is two observations about Brexit. The first is nothing is simple. It's more than possible that the number of international students, as you will be concerned about, I'm sure, could fall significantly when Brexit occurs. That's the consensus opinion. And if it happened, it would be a tragedy for our universities. We've done lots of work at HEPI about the benefits of diverse campuses with lots of international students. There's some press coverage of one piece we did that showed a quarter of the world's countries have someone leading them who was at a very top level, monarch, prime minister or president, who was educated in the UK tertiary sector. On the other hand, as you know, there hasn't been much incentive to recruit EU students until the numbers cap was removed because they displaced British students. There are 3 times as many non-EU international students as EU ones in the country. And in fact, when the taxpayer subsidy for full international, non-EU international students went in the 1980s, everybody said then the numbers would fall off a cliff. In fact, the opposite happened because that was the point at which universities started charging full economic fees and more to their students, and there was a real cash incentive to recruit international students. Now, I'm not saying that will happen. All I'm saying is we mustn't, as a sector, I think, let our pessimism help create and shape the very events that we want to avoid. I've even heard it said that the election of Trump can actually help in the recruitment of staff and students to the UK because the US suddenly appears a less propitious place to study and work. Who knows? This is an article in the Times last week suggesting that it may even facilitate better relations with our EU partners, currently still partners, of course. Who knows? But I'm just suggesting there may be a few small silver linings to some of the big black clouds that we face. And the second point I want to make about Brexit is that I think some universities were caught out on the 23rd of June. It was clear where staff and students stood in relationship to the referendum, and we ourselves did some polling of students which proved how pro-Remain they were. And on referendum day, of course, many universities were shocked to find they were in part of the country where a majority of people voted to leave. Here in Plymouth is one of the few places the Sun described as having one of the highest leave votes. There was in a list of 4 places they had. And as a sector, I think we must be willing to listen and host and debate with mainstream contrary voices. And I sense, as I travel around the country talking to universities, a willingness actually in universities to engage more with the communities in which they reside. And our most recent publication was written for us by a former Plymouth employee, of course, Bill Rammell, the current Vice-Chancellor of the University of Bedfordshire and formerly Higher Education Minister himself, and he said in his report that Brexit and the referendum result has placed a real and significant burden on universities to take a more substantial role in civil society, rebuilding public trust through active engagement and offering accessible pathways to expertise the public sees as relevant and valuable. And for me, as someone who's interested in public policy, I hope that will also mean we can break down the vogue for attacking expertise, because one might argue that never before have we needed some of the expertise that exists in universities if we're going to extricate ourselves successfully from the EU and indeed some of the other international challenges in which we live. And of course, thinking about the other side of the Atlantic, you'll have read over the weekend Donald Trump settled the legal action over Trump University. Trump University, for those of you who haven't looked at it, was an organisation that sold courses claiming to be undergraduate, postgrad and doctoral courses in Trump's business wisdom. If you look at it close up, it was actually some people who've been trained in techniques from timeshare companies selling courses. And of course, university in the US, just as in the UK, is a protected term, and people were taking on about $35,000 of debt for their courses. And Trump's legal team had been planning to defend the action of the university in court by saying saying all their claims were mere marketing puffery, which in the US is a legal term you can use to say you can exaggerate so long as you're not you don't actually really think anybody will really believe your exaggerations. And that was going to be his legal defense in court. So perhaps it's no great surprise that they settled. And here's the story of that in 3 tweets if you haven't been following it closely. In February, Trump said, Trump University has a 98% approval rating. I could have settled but won't out of principle. The other day he said, I settled the lawsuit for a small fraction of the potential award, because as president I have to focus on our country. And the third one was, the only bad thing about winning the presidency is that I did not have the time to go through a long but winning trial on Trump U, too bad. Make of that what you will, but it is at least an introduction perhaps into some of the themes of the Higher Education and Research Bill that we are focusing on in the UK. My view is England, because it is mainly a bill about England, my view is England has a clear need for a new legal framework for higher education in the UK. And the reason I say that is when university funding for teaching was, we went to £9,000 tuition fees, and the teaching grant from HEPI was absolutely slashed. That left us in a situation where many universities now get very little funding for teaching from HEPI, and it of course also has left us with a situation where a growing number of universities, sometimes quite big ones, actually often not with university in their title, but higher education institutions, the alternative providers, are getting no money from HEPI at all, and HEPI has no oversight over them. So HEPI has really lost the power of the purse, both over part of the sector that that has been growing and over which it never had the power of the purse, and another sector, a bit of the sector where it now doesn't fund them so significantly. So I wholeheartedly welcome the idea of new higher education legislation. When I worked for David Willits, I worked on the 2011 higher education white paper, and did my bit to try and fight for a new legal framework for higher education in the UK. When I got to HEPI in early 2014, my first publication was the one on the screen there, a case for why we need new higher education legislation. But of course, as with all legislation, the devil is in the details. And I just want to drill down into 3 things in the bill which are worth looking at, I think, in more detail. And the first is that issue of new providers. And one of the recommendations in the bill is that new institutions could set up and from day one have probationary degree awarding powers. And I would say all of us in this room could do that, but actually there's lots of expertise in this room. It could be lots of people somewhere else without any expertise setting up and applying for degree awarding powers. My view is new institutions have to start somewhere. Plymouth University wasn't always a university. Every institution was a new provider once. So I have no problem with diversity. I have no problem with a new entrance. However, I do think in recent years it's been too hard for good new providers to get off the ground and too easy for dodgy ones. And I have spent time literally just wandering around the East End of London looking at the physical entities of some of the organisations that got a lot of student loan funding in recent years. So the key question for me is how high or low will the bar be? And some of the press coverage suggests Facebook, Apple, Google, those sorts of companies will apply for degree awarding powers. If you ring up their press offices, by the way, they don't know what you're talking about and have no interest, say they have no interest in doing this. And although those are all wonderful companies, I'm not sure I would want them to have degree awarding powers immediately because they have no record of delivering higher education. A couple of weeks ago, of course, we had Dyson University in the press. So James Dyson, the vacuum cleaner entrepreneur, has said he's going to set up a new university. But the spin, if you look closely at that, was pretty much at the level you would expect for someone who could convince people to spend £300 on a hairdryer. Because if you look closely at that, and Joe Johnson had a piece in the Times saying this was evidence of his strategy working. But if you look closely, it's only going to have 25 students in the first year. It's going to teach University of Warwick qualifications, not Dyson's own qualifications. It's therefore perhaps not quite the original. It is not actually that in tune with the parts of the bill. And my view is, the question is, will it end up more like the vacuum, Dyson, Hoover, whatever, that transform the market? Or do you remember this, the Dyson washing machine, which no longer exists? And so we'll find out. But that, I think, is probably a bit of a red herring. Now, the new legislation also seeks to transform the arm's length bodies that you have to deal with. And Sajid Javid was very keen on saying, when he was the Secretary of State for Business in the old department, that the number of arm's length bodies you have to deal with will fall from 10 to 2. This slide's got a tiny bit corrupted, but it does sort of show you what the 10, if for some reason it works on Macs and not on PCs, but the 10 that you currently have to deal with are HEPI, Offer, the 7 research councils, and Innovate UK. So that adds up to 10. And they're saying that in future you'll only have to deal with 2 because Offer is going to be folded into HEPI, the 7 research councils in Innovate UK and the research bit of HEPI are all going to come within UKRI. So in future you'll only have to deal with 2. And I've tried to draw this out, and to me that makes 11, not 2, because they also try to emphasise that the research councils will continue to have an independent identity, as will Innovate UK, as will Research England. So I can send you a clean slide of this without all the dollar signs, but to my sense that is not the simplification the ministers sometimes say. And my argument for many months has been the second bit, the bottom half of that chart, probably can be made to work, but it needs more money to lubricate it, because one of the arguments Joe Johnson's been using is you have to set up UKRI above all the research councils and the Innovate UK and all the rest of it, because it'd be much easier in future to fund interdisciplinary research if you do that. But that money will have to come from existing budgets unless there's new cash. And of course, we are now expecting new cash from Philip Hammond in tomorrow's autumn statement, but we don't yet know quite how many strings will be attached to it. Theresa May has said £2 billion of extra funding in this Parliament. Now, some people say the UKRI will provide a louder voice for science and research separate from government, but there's also a risk here, I think, because a combination of the Grand Challenges Research Fund, which is extra research funding coming from the international aid budget, plus the new fund that we're expecting to be announced tomorrow, which will be called the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, also suggests that ministers are not prepared to let go of decisions over research funding, and also that they're more interested in close to market research than more experimental research, in my opinion. Now, third issue on which the bill on which a head of steam is building up on the bill, is a proposal that the Office for Students should have the power to revoke royal charters from universities, therefore essentially stopping them from being universities. Effectively, a right to remove university title from almost anybody is the way the legislation is written. This has been very controversial. This is an article from the Financial Times by Martin Wolf, where he said, in the UK, no institutions have more successfully stood the test of time, and none better illustrate the value of enduring autonomy than universities. So why does this government propose not only to turn them into the equivalent of purveyors of baked beans, but to seize the power to abolish their independence by administrative fiat? This disaster has to be stopped. So that was his take on it, and you can see the headline there: UK university reforms are a betrayal of conservative principles. My view is this article was a bit over the top, in my view. I remember when we were putting together the 2011 higher education white paper, and we discussed a very similar proposal with Universities UK and the sector, and at that point the official line we got, certainly in private, from Universities UK was that they were so worried about the risk of new entrants and something going wrong with new entrants, that they thought the government should have the right to remove titles and degree awarding powers, etc., from new entrants, and therefore they accepted, because otherwise it'd be a reputational risk for the whole sector, and they actually accepted the price worth paying for that would be a mechanism a little bit like the one in the current bill. But I think it looks as if UUK's line is shifting on that. And in fact, there were lots of attempts yesterday in the House of Commons to amend the bill, because there was the report stage, which is when so the bill has been being looked at line by line in committee in the House of Commons, and then that then reports back to the House of Commons, and you can put down new amendments. And that happened only yesterday. And there have been lots of attempts to amend the bill sensibly. For example, I think perhaps the most notable person who's been doing that is Wes Streeting, the former president of the NUS, now a Labour MP. The ministers throughout the committee stage of the bill were very reluctant to amend the bill at all. But when it came back to the House of Commons yesterday, they did realise they had to prove they'd moved a little bit. And they did offer new amendments, which passed, on having a dedicated board member of the Office for Students with experience promoting the interests of students, by protecting the autonomy of universities more. For example, they said that the Office for Students would not be able to ban any particular course or require any particular course of any university. And also they're going to mandate the Office for Students to report on the financial sustainability of universities, a role that HEPI's been doing, but it wasn't clear that the Office for Students would do that. And I think such changes are sensible, but anyone who thinks they'll remove all the controversy around the bill, I think should look again, because the bill is only halfway through its parliamentary process. It hasn't reached the House of Lords yet, and the latest amendments may buy off some opposition, but they won't assuage, I think, some of the angriest members of the House of Lords. Professor Martin Rees, for example, a crossbench peer, former Astronomer Royal, former Master of Trinity College, Cambridge, who has said the end bit of that matters really. An article in The Guardian, he said, I hope to be one of those calling on the government to shelve the nurse proposals, which are some of the research changes in the bill. Well, he'll be able to vote against them because he's a member of the House of Lords, as is actually Martin Wolf's wife, Alison Wolf, who has been equally vocal. So I think the bill will have a very tricky time in the House of Lords. And if you don't agree with me, consider this. These data's a tiny bit out of date. The blue section should be just a tiny bit bigger. But that is the makeup of the House of Lords by party. And what you will see is the Conservative Party, the Blue, do not have a majority in the House of Lords. It is very easy for the government to lose votes in the House of Lords. In fact, since last year's general election, I checked the figures yesterday, it may have gone up since, who knows, but the government had lost 69 votes in the House of Lords since last year's general election. As I said, it's a tiny bit out of date because it doesn't have the figures for Cameron's resignation honours list in it, but which made the blue go a bit bigger, but not much bigger. And while their lordships, I think, are bound to try and water down some elements of the bill, I would actually like to see them add some new clauses as well. And some of the things we've been calling for is, because you don't get higher education legislation often, by the way, you get about once every 15 years, 92, 2004, 2016. every dozen years or so, I should say. And we've called for to learn from New Zealand. This is a recent report we did by someone who lives in New Zealand on all the stuff New Zealand does to get student loans back from people who've left New Zealand. They have a much more effective regime than we do. We've called for the inclusion of mental health action plans in universities' access and participation agreements. We've called in Bill Rammell's paper for a new public interest duty on the Office for Students to make sure the sector as a whole is fulfilling public interest duties. But let me move on now. I mean, one major thing which I know has been the theme of your day, which isn't really in the bill much, it's in there a tiny bit, is the Teaching Excellence Framework. And it's clearly meant to be the second plank, second half of Joe Johnson's legacy when he ceases to be the minister, and I suspect he's on an upward trajectory, because as a minister in your first job, if you get a bill through and something like the TEF, that is quite an achievement. Between the let's think a little bit about why they're so keen on a TEF. Between the 1970s and the 1990s, effectively the Thatcher major years, the number of students doubled pretty much. That's what this graph shows. But the amount of funding for each one halved, more or less. So that you basically doubled the system without spending an extra penny more in real cash terms, in real terms rather. And that had a big negative impact on students, in my opinion. I was a student in that time. And of course, it was partly remedied by the reintroduction of tuition fees in '98, and then they were tripled in 2006, and then they were tripled again in 2012. And that, of course, as you know, has led, it wasn't all new money, of course, but has led to newer campuses, better campuses, more world-class research, and of course, it has to be said, increases in senior staff pay. But the government, of course, are worried that all that extra resource, undoing some, but by no means all of what's shown in that chart, has not been matched by commensurate improvements in the quality of the academic experience of students. And to my mind, and we can debate this, but to my mind they have something of a point for three reasons. First, the single biggest thing HEPI does each year is a survey of 15,000 undergraduates, and we've been doing it for 10 years. And there's some of the core data about it. 15,000 full-time undergraduates. You can have the SPSS file going back a number of years so you can see how Plymouth students fare. And we ask questions on policy, on workload, and all sorts of other things. One of the findings we find year after year, we can break it down at a more granular level than this, but this is how many hours students work, broken down by contact hours, independent study, and also placements. And what it shows is, while some students work well over 40 hours a week, which is the QAA recommended amount of work for a full-time student, on average, students are working about 30 hours a week. So only doing about 3/4 of what the QAA recommend. And I emphasize this is not just a contact hours chart, this is total workload. We also find falling perceptions of value for money. Of course, the price of higher education's gone up, but the resource hasn't gone up totally in line because the teaching grants collapsed so much. But it's nonetheless an interesting chart because you'll see the English figure, which is the one that ends at the bottom, started sort of in the middle of the pack. And only about a third of students in England now say they think they get very good value for money, good or very good value for money from their higher education. It stayed up, of course, in places like Scotland, where fees are much less likely to be charged. And we also find year after year that about a third of students say they would choose another course if they had their time again. And then secondly, alongside the quantitative data like this, of course, is the perpetual anecdotes you hear if you're the Minister for Higher Education. And I know from my own time in Whitehall that ministers get tired of the West London dinner party conversations about their own children being at universities, not having the workload they expect. I get it too. I was on the telly talking about this data, and my neighbours didn't know what I did for a job. And after they'd seen me on telly talking about it, they came up to me and started telling me about their daughter's experience. Not at Plymouth, I hasten to add, a different university. So I get it as well. And I know, as the director of an evidence-based think tank, that the plural of anecdote is not evidence. I do realise that. But there nonetheless comes a point where these massive anecdotes become meaningful in Whitehall policymaking terms. And the third reason why I think ministers are so interested in the TEF, and we were talking about it in the department before I left, which was before last year's general election, I left in 2013, is that when £9,000 fees were introduced, ministers said two slightly contradictory things, and I know because I was encouraging them to say them. On the one hand, we said to students, don't worry about the debt. It's not real debt. It won't feel like credit card debt or anything. And the other point we said to universities, get ready for a massive wave of consumer power. Students are going to be more demanding than ever before. And I think, I haven't really got time to go into it, I think both of those things turned out to be half true. And I think universities have actually made quite big changes since the tuition fee vote back in 2010 in terms of teaching and learning. But the problem is, if you're the minister, it's very hard to prove that. If someone says to you as the Minister for Higher Education, prove to me UK research is really good, you can say, well, here's some league tables. Here's the Elsevier study that's done once every 2 years for the business department showing it's really good. Here's the REF results. But if you're the minister and you want to prove the quality of teaching and learning in universities, it's much harder to do. So I have some sympathy with where the government's coming from and why they want a TEF. But having said that, we at HEPI have produced, I think, more critiques of the TEF than any other single organisation. They are, you might argue, a little bit contradictory in their conclusions, which is the luxury of working in a think tank, not a political party. But they include this one, which was our response to the Green Paper, which we published in January. And this it had a chapter by Graham Gibbs, who's done a lot of work for the Higher Education Academy. And he thinks, forget the government's proxies for the TEF, use student engagement measures. So that was his analysis. We also had our annual lecture last year by Andreas Schleicher, head of the education of the OECD. He says, yes, the government's proxies are rubbish, but it's not so much about student engagement, it's about learning gain. Let's just measure how much students know when they enter and when they leave. He would say that, wouldn't he, because he's the guy behind the PISA tests in schools. But nonetheless, he's interested in learning gain. I've got to say, neither Graham nor Andreas totally explained how you do these things, because of course these are both emerging sciences, if you like. We then published a piece by a lady called Louisa Darrian, who now actually works with Sajid Javid in the DCLG department, but was then a witch. And she did something that no one else has done, very simple. She just looked at rating systems in other publicly funded parts of life, so the healthcare, early years, schools. And she just looked, are there any lessons? And one of the things she found was they'd had a terrible time in the health and social care sector because they implemented rating schemes just as they were ripping up all their quangos and changing them all. And one of her lessons was don't do that. And of course, we'll be implementing the TEF when we're having the biggest ripping up of arm's length bodies and resettling them and starting them all from scratch and losing all that inherent memory. So I think that was an interesting lesson. And then more recently, we published a piece by Paul Blackmore. There's two different things, chapters in there. One's about Delhi, actually. The other one is specifically about the TEF by Paul Blackmore of King's College London. And he says, look, if you want teaching to have prestige, the way research has prestige, you need to draw more connections between teaching and research and not drive a wedge between them. So those are, there's a lot more that could be said about each of those. They're all freely available on our website. But I think they all critique the metrics, the inputs into the TEF, and I worry about them too. I think, to be fair to the government, if you want to get a TEF off the ground quickly, you've got to use existing data rather than wait for better measures to come along. And of course, if you wait for perfect measures to come along, the TEF would never happen because nothing's ever perfect. I don't like the feeling, I've got to say, and our survey shows the overwhelming majority of students don't like the feeling either. I think that confuses ends and means, and when the TEF is going to be in its infancy, it's not going to be it's not going to tell us as much as we would like it to tell us. And I think linking that to fees is an unhelpful, unnecessary, something that's not necessary. And of course, the government's concern is no one will take us seriously if it's not linked to fees, but they're doing it in Scotland, and there's no link to fees in Scotland or Wales. So I'm not sure I buy that argument. The other thing I would say, though, is I think the government are absolutely determined to have the TEF. Of course they are, and they'll get it. But they have actually proven, a lot of audiences rile when I say this, but I think they've proven remarkably flexible on the details. The timeline has changed. They've made it clear it's going to be at a disciplinary level in future. You're going to be able to submit detailed qualitative information. And if you think back to when Joe Johnson first announced the TEF, and I was in the room when he did it, and he promised it wouldn't be big, bossy or bureaucratic. Things have changed since then. For me, it's best articulated, or illustrated, I should say, but in the wonky charts, if you look at the wonky website. That was how their original iteration of how the TEF will work. As I say, that's on the wonky website. That's not my not my thing. And then that became a bit more, it's more the visual thing that matters here. That became a bit more complicated when we had the white paper. And then when we had the tier 2 technical consultation, it now looks like that. So you can see how it's got more and more complicated. And these are very useful charts actually on the Wonky website, which I draw your attention to. The government would say it's taken many years to get the REF to a broadly equilibrium point that people think it's fair, and that it will could take a certain amount of time to get the TEF there as well, which I guess is a fair point, and it's of course why conferences like yours today are so very valuable. I'll stop there, not least because I've got to run off to a taxi in about 10 minutes, but I hope there's a little bit of time for comments, and thank you very much for inviting me. I've got other speeches to deliver similar but different to this in Manchester and Greenwich later this week as well, so it shows you, I think, how much interest in the sector there is in these issues at the moment. Thank you very much.